At my daughter's graduation, I kept silent about the inheritance, $12 million from my late husband. Thankfully I did, because just 3 days later her newlywed husband dragged a contract into my office and said, "Sign it or get out." Subscribe to the channel and share your stories in the comments. And now let's get started. My name is Nancy Carter. I am 59 years old. And the day I thought would crown my life with pride, the day my daughter Kelly graduated from college, turned into my public humiliation. It began like any other graduation ceremony, with the wide stadium buzzing with chatter, programs fluttering in people's hands, proud families craning their necks for the best view of their children. The May sun pressed down like a spotlight, making the black robes shimmer faintly with heat. Banners in the school's colors rippled in the breeze. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, mispronouncing names, pausing for applause that swelled and died like waves. I sat in the middle rows, my hands folded carefully in my lap, my spine straight. I had chosen my dress with care. Powder blue, modest but elegant, something George would have liked. I told myself I was ready to sit quietly, to clap at the right time, to let Kelly shine. That day belonged to her. Or so I believed. 2 rows ahead of me, Sharon, my daughter's brand new mother-in-law, sat flanked by her husband and son. They had insisted on arriving early to claim front row seats, as though their presence were the highlight of the event. Sharon's hair was lacquered into place, a shimmering helmet of blonde that caught the sun like a mirror. She wore pearls large enough to choke on, a suit that screamed money even though I knew she had never worked a day in her life. She leaned in toward her husband but didn't bother to lower her voice. "Poor girl," she said, her words laced with mock sympathy. "Her mother's just a broke retiree." The sentence landed like a slap. I heard the faint, deliberate chuckle of her husband, and then worse, I heard Kelly laugh. Not a nervous laugh. Not a protest disguised as humor. A laugh of agreement, light and dismissive, as though my entire life, my sacrifices, were nothing more than an awkward detail she wished to brush away. David, my new son-in-law, smirked and added, "At least she won't have to worry about Mom asking for help. Retirees can't afford much." The group chuckled again, their voices carrying far in the open air. I sat very still. My face arranged itself into a polite smile, the kind you paste on in church funerals when your knees are shaking. My jaw ached from clenching, but I refused to let my lips tremble. My back was straight as if held up by a steel rod. Outwardly I looked calm. Inwardly I was disintegrating. Nobody knew. Nobody knew that when George died 5 years ago, he left me not just grief but a secret inheritance. $9 million tucked away in accounts, safeguarded by lawyers and documents. They all thought his land business had gone bankrupt to cover debts. They believed I was scraping by on a small pension, stretching dollars at the grocery store, living quietly in my paid-off but modest house. They thought I had nothing. And I let them believe it. Because if I revealed the truth, if Sharon with her greedy eyes or David with his hungry ambition, or even Kelly, my own daughter, knew the size of the fortune I held, they would devour me alive. They would strip me until nothing remained but numbers in their accounts. So I sat in silence while the people I once believed were my family humiliated me in public. Kelly walked across the stage to receive her diploma. The crowd clapped, whistles pierced the air. Cameras clicked in a fever. I waited for her to look at me, to find me in the sea of faces, the mother who raised her, who skipped meals to buy her books, who worked double shifts after George's death so tuition checks would clear on time. She didn't. She waved to Sharon and her family, smiling as though their approval were the only one that mattered. My applause was swallowed by the roar of strangers. My hands ached from clapping, but I might as well have been invisible. After the ceremony, people spilled out into the courtyard, hugging their graduates, posing for photos. Balloons floated overhead, and flowers exchanged hands. Families clustered in tight circles, each one a fortress of joy. I stood on the edge, clutching the small bouquet of lilies I had brought for Kelly, the stems dampening my palm. Sharon reached her first. She embraced Kelly, loud with congratulations, her pearls glinting under the sun. David kissed her cheek, already claiming her as if she were more theirs than mine. They snapped photo after photo with Kelly in the center, their arms wrapped around her. I hovered close, waiting for my moment. But Sharon's sharp shoulder nudged me aside with casual precision. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The message was clear. Step back, retiree. You don't belong in this picture. When Kelly finally noticed me, it was only because I extended the flowers. Oh, thanks, Mom, she said quickly, setting them on a bench without looking at them again. Then she turned back to Sharon, who was already planning a celebratory dinner for family. Their family, not mine. The humiliation pressed down on me like the sun's heat. Every laugh, every whispered word, every dismissive glance was a blade, and I took them all in silence. People passed by, their eyes darting from Sharon's expensive clothes to my simple dress, making their judgments. It wasn't just a graduation that day. It was an unspoken verdict. I was no longer the center of my daughter's world. I wasn't even part of her circle. I was a relic tolerated for formality's sake, already being pushed into the shadows. I left before the dinner. No one stopped me. No one noticed. I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly the skin whitened around my knuckles. The bouquet of lilies lay on the passenger seat, wilted by the time I pulled into the driveway. That night, I sat in George's old chair, the house still heavy with his absence, and thought about the day. My humiliation wasn't an accident. It was a warning. Sharon and her family weren't just arrogant, they were staking their claim on Kelly, erasing me in the process. And Kelly, my own daughter, was letting them. But what none of them knew, what none of them could even imagine, was that I was not powerless. My silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Because $9 million slept quietly in accounts with my name on them. $9 million that could burn their smug little empire to ashes if I chose. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and whispered to myself, they think I'm broke. Let them. They would learn the truth in time. But on that day, at my daughter's graduation, I carried my humiliation like a crown of thorns. It cut me, it bled me, but I endured. Because sometimes silence is sharper than any blade. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone thinks is powerless. At the wedding, I understood something I had not wanted to admit at the graduation. My daughter no longer belonged to me. She had been claimed, absorbed into another family like a possession. The ceremony was beautiful. Yes, white roses, soft violin music, Kelly in a dress that shimmered like a pearl under the lights. But beneath all the beauty, I felt the cut of something cold and deliberate. Exclusion. David, my new son-in-law, was only 27, but he strutted as if he owned the air we breathed. He had a face too smooth for his arrogance, hair slicked back with precision, and a voice always pitched loud enough for people across the room to hear. I could not decide whether he wanted to be admired or feared. Perhaps both. Sharon, his mother, never left his side, not even during the reception. She orbited around him like a queen mother, and she made her position clear within the first hour of the celebration. She leaned close to me, her perfume thick as syrup, and said with a smile that carried no warmth, Kelly belongs to our family now. Not yours. The words were sharp but soft, designed to pierce without leaving visible wounds. I remember blinking at her, stunned, trying to process the cruelty delivered so casually. My daughter was standing just feet away, laughing with David, unaware that Sharon had just declared war on me. Later, during the reception, I approached the head table where the newlyweds were seated. I had rehearsed my congratulations, imagined clinking my glass with theirs in a moment of motherly pride. But as I stepped forward, Sharon's hand landed firmly on my shoulder. With a surprising strength, she pushed me aside and slid into the chair next to Kelly. This is for family, she said lightly, adjusting her pearls as though nothing unusual had happened. Family. The word rang in my ears, sour and poisonous. I was Kelly's mother. Who else could claim that title? Who else had carried her for 9 months, labored for 12 hours to bring her into this world, stayed awake through childhood fevers and teenage tears? But none of that mattered to Sharon. In her eyes, my motherhood had expired the moment Kelly signed her marriage certificate. So I sat at a table on the edge of the reception hall, smiling politely at strangers, while Sharon raised glass after glass in Kelly's honor. David's relatives gave loud speeches about family legacy, about strength and wealth, about how lucky Kelly was to marry into such a prominent household. Their suits were cut from fine fabrics, their watches glittered under the chandelier light. Their words were sharp with pride. I sipped water from a plain glass unnoticed. What none of them knew was that half the wedding was paid with my money. Quiet money, Money transferred in neat, discreet payments so that Kelly and David could afford the venue, the flowers, the orchestra. When bills threatened to overwhelm them, I wrote the checks. When Kelly worried about costs, I told her to focus on enjoying her day. I did it gladly, without seeking recognition, because I wanted her happiness more than my own comfort. And yet not a single toast mentioned me. Not one word of thanks. Sharon raised her glass and declared, "This wedding was made possible by the strength and support of our family." Their family. The irony burned in my throat like acid. I remember Thomas, my son, standing awkwardly at my side that night. He was only 25 then, tall, quiet, his eyes darting between me and Kelly as though trying to bridge a gap too wide for him to cross. He saw how Sharon dismissed me, how David's relatives laughed too loudly when I spoke, how Kelly turned her face toward them instead of me. He saw it all, and his silence was heavy, almost protective. But even Thomas couldn't shield me from the truth. I had become a guest at my own daughter's wedding. The photographer's flash seared the moment into permanence. Hundreds of pictures in which I am absent. The official album arrived weeks later, heavy with glossy pages, filled with smiling faces and glittering glasses. Page after page of Sharon, of David's uncles, of cousins and friends. Kelly's joy radiated in every *T, but beside her always was Sharon. Not me. My own daughter's wedding album erased me as though I had never existed. I placed the book on my shelf and never opened it again. But I remembered. I remembered Sharon's possessive grip on Kelly's hand, the way David corrected me when I said something, the way Kelly's laughter blended more easily with theirs than with mine. I remembered the feeling of standing on the periphery, invisible, while strangers toasted the child I had raised. And all the while my silence held. The inheritance remained my secret. They thought I was a poor, fading widow, hanging on to the scraps of my pension, grateful for a seat at their table. They thought they could mock me, ignore me, erase me. Let them. Because I knew what Sharon did not. I held the real power. Quiet, hidden, waiting. That night, as I drove home alone from the reception hall, the streetlights casting long shadows across my windshield, I realized Sharon had declared more than territory. She had issued a challenge. She wanted me gone, erased, stripped from Kelly's life. And I also knew one thing with certainty. She would not stop until she succeeded. But neither would I. It began with comments, small at first, dressed in politeness, but carrying a sharp edge underneath. Just 3 days after the wedding, Sharon called me. Her tone was sugary, the kind reserved for salespeople trying to lure you into a bad deal. "Nancy, dear," she began, as if she had known me and *mately for decades. "I was just thinking, with that big house of yours, doesn't it feel like too much for you to manage all alone? Maybe it would be wise to transfer part of the deed to Kelly and David. You know, for their future. Could give them a good start." I felt the words press against me like a hand at my throat. Transfer. Deed. Future. Not advice. Not concern. A demand dressed up as kindness. I kept my voice light. "Thank you, Sharon, but I manage just fine. The house doesn't feel too big for me." "Oh, Nancy," she chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You're being modest. These things are complicated at your age. Why not make life easier for everyone?" At my age. I was 59, not 90. I hung up shortly after, my fingers trembling as I placed the phone back in its cradle. The next day David came by. He didn't knock. Just strolled in as if my home had already become his territory. He walked through the living room with that entitled stride, glancing at my furniture, my framed photographs, the history of my life on the walls. He sat down without asking, legs spread wide, claiming space that wasn't his. "Mom," he said, using the word as casually as if it were his right. "I've been thinking. Managing a house like this must be a lot. Your pension is steady, but is it really enough? Maybe Kelly and I could take some of the responsibility. You know, combine resources." He tilted his head, smiling, but his eyes were cold, calculating. I smiled back. "I'm doing fine, David. Thank you for worrying." "Worrying?" He laughed, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm just being practical. A house this size, all the bills, maintenance, repairs, it's a burden. You shouldn't have to carry that." A burden. That was the word he chose. Not home. Not sanctuary. A burden. I kept my mask on, nodded politely and walked him to the door. But inside my chest burned. Each conversation was a test, a probe for weakness. Sharon dangled her concern like bait. David pushed with casual arrogance. They weren't suggesting. They were measuring. They wanted to know how far they could go before I resisted. And Kelly, my daughter, stood silent in the background, letting them speak for her. One evening she called. Her voice was soft, almost rehearsed, the way a child recites lines in a school play. "Mom," she said, "you know Sharon just wants the best for everyone. And David, he's just trying to make sure you're okay. It would make things easier if you worked with them. We could take care of you." Take care of me. The words made my stomach twist. I could hear Sharon's phrases hiding in Kelly's mouth. David's hand guiding her tone. "Kelly," I said gently, "I'm fine. Truly. I don't need anyone to take care of me yet." "Yet," she echoed, her voice tightening. "But you will. You don't want to be a burden on us, do you?" Burden again. That word was becoming their favorite knife. After the call, I sat in the dark of my kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind me, the lilies from her graduation already wilted in their vase. I thought of all the nights I stayed awake when she was a child, soothing her fevers, counting coins to make sure she had lunch money, patching her clothes so she would never feel ashamed. She had been my purpose, my reason for pushing through the grief after George died. Now she was a mouthpiece for Sharon. The pressure built quickly. Within a week, Sharon called again, this time suggesting I sell the house altogether and move closer to Kelly and David. She framed it as a chance for me to be part of their lives, to not be isolated. But her voice betrayed her. She didn't want me close. She wanted the house. Then David began dropping hints about my savings. He asked casually over dinner, "So, how's your pension? Big enough to cover everything? Or are you dipping into savings?" His fork scraped against his plate as he spoke. His eyes locked on me with a false innocence that made my skin crawl. The questions were too precise. He wasn't just curious. He was fishing. I answered lightly, dodging, keeping my mask in place. But inside I could feel the net tightening. It wasn't just pressure. It was a campaign. A steady drumbeat of comments, suggestions, questions. Sharon whispered poison. David pushed entitlement. Kelly softened their blows with her daughterly voice. But all three worked toward the same goal. Strip me of what I had, piece by piece, until I was dependent on them. I thought back to the wedding reception, to Sharon shoving me away from the head table. It had not been a simple act of rudeness. It had been the opening move of a game. And I understood then. I was not dealing with a family welcoming me into their circle. I was dealing with predators circling their prey. My silence protected me. They didn't know about George's hidden fortune. They didn't know about the $9 million I held in secrecy, guarded like a fortress. To them, I was just a widow clinging to her pension, ripe for manipulation. That ignorance was my shield. For now. But I also knew shields could break. And each day, with each comment, each probing question, I felt the first cracks forming. The warning signs were clear. And I would be a fool not to see them. It was the third day after their wedding when David made his boldest move yet. Until then, their attacks had been whispers, hints, and veiled suggestions, easy enough for me to brush aside. But on that day, he tore the mask off. He came into my life like a storm, loud and shameless, determined to humiliate me in the most public way possible. I was at the bank working a short afternoon shift. Even though I didn't need the income, thanks to George's hidden inheritance, I had kept the job for structure, for dignity. Numbers and ledgers were calming to me. They obeyed rules, unlike people. I liked the smell of ink on fresh paper, the neat order of transactions. It was my way of proving, even to myself, that I was still capable, still useful, not just some widow passing time. The lobby was quiet that day. A handful of clients waited in line, the hum of printers filling the air, polite whispers passing between tellers. I was seated at my desk, reviewing account transfers for a retired teacher who had trusted me for years. Then the door swung open. Heavy steps. Presence too loud for a bank. David. He didn't wait to be announced. He didn't nod at the receptionist. He didn't even glance at the other customers. He walked straight toward me, his shoes clicking hard against the polished floor, his confidence filling the room like poison gas. In his hand was a thick folder. He dropped it on my desk with a smack that made the papers inside tremble. Conversations around us paused. Heads turned. "Sign this," he said. His voice was sharp, commanding, loud enough to make the nearest clients stiffen in their chairs. I blinked at him, keeping my expression neutral. "David, this is my workplace. If you'd like to talk, we can." "No." He cut me off, slamming his palm on the folder. "Right here. Right now. Transfer the house and your savings to us or get out. You don't need them anymore. Kelly and I will take care of everything from now on." The words echoed across the lobby. The old teacher in front of me dropped his pen. A woman at the counter froze mid-signature. Everyone heard. That was David's goal. Humiliation, spectacle, to corner me where I couldn't escape. My face burned, but I forced my body into stillness. I looked at the folder, pretending to skim the papers though my vision blurred with fury. Legal documents already filled in, with blank spaces waiting for my signature. Lines of text transferring property, granting power, handing over my life. I could feel eyes on me. Pity, shock, judgment. Strangers seeing me not as a mother or a widow, but as a weak old woman bullied by her son-in-law. I wanted the floor to swallow me. David leaned closer, his breath hot, his voice lower but sharper. "This is for your own good. Stop clinging to things you can't manage. Sign it." For a moment I imagined what would happen if I obeyed. If I let my hand move, let the pen scratch across the paper. My house gone. My savings gone. My independence gone. In their hands I would be reduced to a shadow, a guest in my own life. And then quietly, beneath the noise of humiliation, another thought whispered. Thank God they don't know. Thank God they didn't know that what sat in my savings account was nothing compared to what George had left me in secret. That the papers David pushed across the desk were laughably small against the weight of $9 million locked in another world, protected by my silence. I lifted my eyes to his. His smirk dared me to resist. Around us the bank remained frozen, every ear straining. "David," I said evenly, my voice calm though my heart pounded like war drums, "I will not sign anything today." He scoffed loudly, looking around as though inviting the clients to join his ridicule. "See? Stubborn. Irrational. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I pushed the folder gently back toward him. "Take it home. If there's anything legitimate, I'll review it with my attorney." The word attorney wiped the smugness off his face for a fraction of a second. But he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that rang false. "Fine. Think about it. But don't wait too long. Kelly deserves stability. You wouldn't want to embarrass her, would you?" Embarrass her. As if I hadn't just been shamed in front of strangers by his public performance. He snatched the folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked out with the same arrogance he carried in. The door slammed behind him. Silence clung to the air. The retired teacher gave me a sympathetic smile, as though he wanted to speak but didn't dare. The woman at the counter whispered something to the teller, her eyes darting toward me. Humiliation burned in my chest, heavier than any insult I had endured before. Not because of what David had said, but because of how easily he had exposed me, made me small in front of strangers, reduced me to a caricature of helplessness. I sat there, hands folded tightly, forcing my breath to stay steady until the lobby noise slowly resumed. People went back to their business, but I felt their pity clinging to me like cobwebs. That night, when I closed my front door and sat in George's old chair, the silence pressed down heavier than usual. I stared at my hands, remembering how steady they had once been when holding our children, when balancing our budget, when building a life from scraps. Now those same hands had trembled over a folder I hadn't signed. But humiliation has a strange effect. It burns you, yes, but it also hardens you. It leaves scars that turn into armor. And as I sat there staring into the shadows of my home, I knew one thing with certainty. Sharon and David had declared open war. And I would not lose. After the scene in the bank, after David's voice had torn my dignity into pieces before strangers, I came home and unlocked the small fireproof box I keep in the back of my closet. I had not opened it in months. My hands shook, not from age but from fury, as I turned the key and lifted the lid. Inside lay my salvation. Folders neatly labeled, account numbers typed in George's meticulous style, tax receipts with my careful handwriting, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope with the lawyer's embossed stamp. $9 million. That number has lived in my chest for years like a double heartbeat. One I can never let anyone hear. When George died, everyone believed his land business had collapsed under debt. It was true partly. He had sold off properties, cleared loans, left behind what most assumed was nothing but scraps. Our neighbors whispered about poor Nancy, left with only a pension and a modest house. Even Kelly pitied me then. But George had not told them the whole truth. He had prepared quietly, secretly, as though he knew death would come too early. He had sold properties not to cover debts, but to hide assets, to funnel the money into accounts that bore only my name. "For you," he had told me one winter night, his voice low, his eyes tired. "They must never know, Nancy. Not the children. Not anyone. Promise me you'll protect it." Promised. And I kept that promise. After his funeral, while mourners filled the house with casseroles and polite words, I slipped away to the lawyer's office. He handed me the papers with a look that told me he understood the weight of secrets. From that day, the inheritance became a shadow I carried. Never spoken of, never hinted at, hidden behind the mask of an ordinary widow scraping by. I continued working part-time at the bank. People assumed I needed the income, and I let them. I paid taxes diligently, filing forms myself so no accountant would pry. I kept the safety deposit box current, visited it twice a year to ensure the documents were untouched. Every precaution was taken. Kelly never suspected. She believed my pension barely covered groceries. She offered sympathy once in a while, but never too much. She liked to remind herself she had risen above me, that she lived in a brighter world. Thomas, my son, never asked. He simply accepted my life as it appeared. The money became not just security but armor. When Sharon called to suggest transferring my house deed, I thought of the $9 million quietly waiting, untouchable. When David slammed that folder on my desk at the bank, demanding I hand over my savings, I almost laughed. What did they think they were stealing? A few scraps? My pension checks? They had no idea what fortress stood behind me. And yet I stayed silent. Because power is not only in possession, it is in secrecy. Had I revealed the truth at the graduation, when Sharon mocked me as a broke retiree, their greed would have doubled overnight. They would have swarmed me like vultures, not bothering with polite masks. They would have brought lawyers, contracts, manipulations far more sophisticated than David's crude folder. No, silence was my shield. But silence can also be heavy. Sometimes at night, lying awake in the dark, I would ask myself if I was cruel. Cruel for letting my children believe I was poor while I lived quietly on wealth they could not imagine. I would replay memories of George telling me to protect the money, to use it wisely, to ensure I was never at the mercy of anyone. "They will show their true faces when they think you are weak," he had warned. "And when they do, you'll know why I hid this." He was right. Now, sitting at my dining table with the documents spread before me, I could almost feel George's presence. The weight of his foresight, the sharpness of his instincts. He had known Kelly's softness, her desire to please stronger voices. He had known that Sharon, a woman like a hawk, would seize the chance to dominate. He had known that David's arrogance would not be contained. $9 million. Enough to rebuild a life from ashes. Enough to walk away from their schemes untouched. Enough to turn the humiliation at the bank into nothing more than theater. I touched the papers gently, my fingers tracing the embossed seals. The accounts were tidy, diversified, growing quietly every year. My husband had left me not only money but freedom, if I chose to use it. But choice is the cruelest part. Because each time I thought about spending even a fraction of that fortune, I remembered Kelly's laughter at the graduation, the way she leaned into Sharon's embrace, the way she brushed off my flowers at her wedding. What would money buy me, if not the love I had already lost? Still, I held on to it. I imagined scenarios. If they forced me into court, I could unleash the inheritance like a sword, cutting through their accusations. If they tried to corner me legally, I could hire an army of attorneys. If they mocked me again in public, I could expose them, remind them I was not the weak widow they thought. But for now, I kept the secret sealed. Because sometimes the greatest P*N is not the one you wield, but the one you keep hidden, waiting, sharpening in silence. I closed the fireproof box, locked it, and slid it back into the closet. My hand steadied as I turned the key. When I emerged into the living room, The house was quiet, heavy with shadows. I sank into George's chair and whispered aloud, as if speaking to him. They think I'm powerless. They think I'm finished. But I have everything. Everything. The words were not boastful. They were a vow. Because soon enough Sharon and David would push further. Kelly would echo their demands with her sweet, poisoned voice. They would try to break me down piece by piece until nothing was left. And when that day came, I would strike. With the truth. With the fortune they had never imagined. With the strength of silence turned into power. The morning after David's performance at the bank, my phone rang. Kelly's name glowed on the screen. My heart clenched before I even answered. Because I already knew her voice would not be her own. Mom? She began softly, almost tenderly. Are you busy? I could hear the rehearsed sweetness, the pauses timed like lines in a play. Sharon's training. David's influence. My daughter, my own daughter, reduced to their mouthpiece. No, I said, keeping my tone neutral. What is it? There was a sigh on the other end, carefully measured, like she wanted me to believe this conversation pained her. It'll just be easier for everyone if you sign the papers. David and I can take care of things. You shouldn't have to worry anymore. Take care of things. The phrase was Sharon's. I'd heard it in her syrupy tone at the wedding. Kelly didn't realize how her borrowed words betrayed her. I sat in silence, letting the weight of her betrayal sink into me. This was the child I had rocked in my arms through fevers, the girl I had fed when George and I barely had enough for ourselves, the young woman whose textbooks I bought by working extra shifts, smiling through exhaustion so she could study without shame. And now her voice, once full of laughter and trust, sounded hollow, like a puppet repeating someone else's lines. Kelly, I said finally, I don't need anyone to take care of me. I've managed on my own for years. Her tone sharpened just slightly. Mom, you don't understand. You'll embarrass yourself if you keep resisting. Sharon says. I cut her off. Sharon is not my concern. And neither is David. The silence that followed was thick. Then in a softer voice, almost pleading. Please, Mom. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I wanted to scream, harder for whom? But I bit my tongue. I let the silence hang until she filled it with nervous laughter and an excuse to hang up. When the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the faded lilies that still lingered in the vase from her graduation. Their petals curled inward, brown and brittle. I had kept them too long, unwilling to throw away what little remained. They stared back at me like a cruel metaphor. Beauty once alive, now wasted, rotting, clinging to a stem that could no longer feed them. That night I dreamed of George. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, his expression grave. I warned you, he said. They will strip you bare if you let them. When I reached for him, he vanished, leaving only the echo of his voice. I woke with tears on my cheeks. The next day at the grocery store, whispers followed me down the aisles. A pair of women by the produce section tilted their heads together, murmuring, That's her. Nancy Carter. Poor thing, being forced out of her own house. Their pity stung more than gossip. At the checkout, the young cashier offered me a senior discount card for folks without family. She said it kindly, almost shyly, but the humiliation hit me like a fist. Without family. That's what people thought of me now. A woman abandoned, a burden cast aside. I drove home with groceries I no longer wanted, the bags heavy on my lap like stones. By the time I reached the front door, my hands were trembling so badly the keys rattled against the lock. This wasn't just pressure anymore. It was a campaign of humiliation. A war of whispers. Sharon and David didn't need to take my money yet. They only needed to destroy my reputation, to isolate me, to paint me as incapable. Then when the town believed it, they could swoop in as the responsible family, taking control under the guise of love. That evening my phone buzzed again. This time it was Sharon. Nancy dear, she said, her tone a parody of concern. I heard you were upset yesterday. Please don't misunderstand us. We only want to help. If you'd sign those documents, Kelly and David could finally breathe easier. And you'd be free of all that stress. Free? I asked. My voice was steady but my heart raced. You mean powerless? Her laugh was high and false. Oh, you do exaggerate. We're family now. There shouldn't be secrets between us. Secrets? She had no idea how much power that word carried. "I'll think about it," I lied and hung up before she could answer. Afterward, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the stack of bills on the counter. Paid on time, neat, proof of my independence. I thought of the $9 million locked away, silent, invisible, untouchable. And I thought of how none of them, not even Kelly, had earned the right to know. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something with bone-deep clarity. Sharon and David weren't merely greedy. They were methodical. They wore masks of care, spoke with voices of concern, but every word was a blade. And Kelly, my child, my pride, my joy, was letting them wield her against me. It broke something inside me. Not completely, not yet. But I felt the first fracture. Still, I did not cry. Instead, I whispered into the darkness, to George, to myself, to the silence. They think I am weak. They think I am old. But I am waiting. And when they push me too far, they will learn what waiting can do. It began as whispers, and whispers always grow into storms. By the end of the week, I couldn't walk into town without feeling eyes on me, sharp and pitying. At the bakery, I overheard two women in line murmur, "That's Nancy Carter. Poor thing, being forced out of her house." They lowered their voices, but not enough. Their words traveled to me, slicing through the air like knives. At the post office, a man I barely knew patted my shoulder as if I were a child who had scraped her knee. "You'll be okay," he said, his tone soaked in condescension. "Families fight, but they'll sort it out. Just don't be too difficult, Too difficult. That was how they already saw me. Not a woman standing her ground. A stubborn old widow making trouble for her daughter's marriage. By Saturday, it was everywhere. At the grocery store, two clerks paused mid-conversation as I passed. "She's the one whose son-in-law wants her out," one whispered. The other sighed. "It happens. Older folks get confused, cling to their houses." They looked at me as if I were deaf, invisible. At the register, the cashier, a girl who couldn't have been older than 19, offered me a laminated card. "Would you like to sign up for our senior discount? It's for people living on a fixed income, without family support." Without family. The words pressed into me like thumbs into a bruise. I walked home with my head high, the bags biting into my fingers, but the tears waited just behind my eyes, hot and insistent. Every errand had turned into another reminder of my supposed disgrace. And yet, I knew where it came from. Sharon, David. Their whispers were no accident. This was their strategy: shame me into compliance. Paint me as incapable. Let the town see me as a burden. A confused retiree too stubborn to accept help. Then, when the ground had softened with gossip, they could step in as saviors, taking control of my house, my money, my dignity. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. That evening, Kelly called again. Her voice was softer this time, tinged with false worry. "Mom, people are talking," she said. "It's embarrassing for everyone. If you just sign, all this would go away. We could present a united front." A united front. I almost laughed. She wanted me to lay my neck on the chopping block so they could call it family unity. "I'm not signing anything," I said flatly. Her tone hardened. "You're making this worse than it has to be. Sharon says." "Kelly," I snapped, sharper than I'd ever spoken to her before. "I don't care what Sharon says." The silence on the line was long, suffocating. Finally, she whispered, "You'll regret this." And then she hung up. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in George's chair with the lights off, the house silent around me, my thoughts a storm. I replayed every humiliation, every whisper, every condescending look. My own daughter had threatened me with regret. The town already believed I was being cast out. Sharon and David were winning their war without even touching the fortune they thought I didn't have. By Monday, the humiliation had escalated. As I walked past the diner, a man at an outdoor table muttered to his companion, "That's her. Nancy Carter. Can you imagine? Kicked out by her own family. Must have been impossible to live with." I didn't flinch. I didn't stop. But inside I shattered. Humiliation piled on humiliation. Gossip grew into judgment, judgment into cruelty. Strangers who once greeted me warmly now looked away, embarrassed to be caught in my orbit. Friends grew silent, unsure what to believe. And through it all, Sharon's laughter echoed in my mind. David's smirk burned in my memory. Kelly's voice replayed like a broken record. You'll regret this. That was the moment I understood with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just pressure. This wasn't just greed. This was war. And if it was war they wanted, I would not be their easy victim. I had endured too much, given too much, sacrificed too much to be erased with whispers. I walked into my study, opened the drawer where George's documents rested, and laid them out on the desk. Deeds, bank records, tax filings, proof of control, proof of independence, proof of the fortune none of them suspected. My humiliation had reached its peak. Now it would transform into something else. Resolve. Because the next move would be mine. The night the whispers became unbearable, I made my decision. Enough of standing still, waiting for their blows. It was time to make my first move. I went to the hallway closet and pulled down the locked box George had left me. The weight of it was familiar. Heavy in my arms, a reminder of all the secrets I had carried alone. On my dining table under the dim light, I spread out every document. Deeds, tax records, statements from accounts Sharon and David couldn't even dream existed. George's will, his letters, every paper that proved what I had, what I controlled. For years I had kept it sealed, believing silence was the best shield. But silence had allowed Sharon's whispers to fester, David's arrogance to grow, Kelly's loyalty to be poisoned. They thought I was defenseless. They thought humiliation would break me. They thought wrong. The next morning I drove downtown with the box strapped into the passenger seat like precious cargo. The streets were empty, the shops just opening. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every block. This wasn't an errand. This was the first step into war. I parked in front of the attorney's office. Not just any attorney, Mr. Langford. A man I had trusted once before, after George's death, when grief threatened to drown me. He was sharp, discreet, and most importantly loyal. When I carried the box inside, his receptionist raised her brows but said nothing. She led me to his office and there he was, gray hair, polished suit, eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Carter. He greeted me warmly. It's been a while. What brings you in? I set the box on his desk. War, I said simply. He blinked, then gave a small, knowing smile. Let's see what ammunition you've brought. For hours we combed through the documents. I told him everything, the graduation whispers, the shove at the wedding, David's stunt at the bank, Sharon's calls, Kelly's betrayal. Each word seemed to darken his expression. Finally he leaned back, tapping the edge of George's will with his pen. Mrs. Carter, do you realize what you hold? You are not only financially secure. You have full legal control. Absolute independence. If they tried to challenge you in court, they'd lose before the first gavel hit. I exhaled a long trembling breath. I had known, but hearing it confirmed felt like armor settling over my shoulders. Then what do? I asked. His eyes sharpened. You wait. You let them dig their own grave, push their demands, make their arrogance public. And when they think you're cornered, you strike with this. He gestured to the documents spread across his desk. I nodded. Waiting I could do. I had waited for years after all, carrying secrets like stones in my pockets. But this time my waiting wouldn't be silence. It would be strategy. That evening when I drove home the air felt different. The humiliation still clung. Yes, but underneath it pulsed something new. Control. I stood in my kitchen, looking around at the house Sharon had called too much for me. The home David wanted transferred. The walls that Kelly believed would soon belong to her and her husband. They were wrong. Every inch, every nail, every memory in this place was mine. And now I had the proof to protect it. I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely allowed. As I drank I thought about the next steps. They would push harder. They would try new tactics. And I would let them, because every attempt would only strengthen the case I was building. For the first time in months, maybe years, I slept soundly. A week later I made my invitation. A family dinner. My idea, though they would believe it was theirs. I told Kelly I wanted to discuss the future. She sounded relieved, perhaps even triumphant, when she agreed. I knew Sharon would be there, her pearls shining like armor. I knew David would come with another folder. Another set of papers ready to shove across my table. And I knew Thomas, my son, would sit quietly until the moment came when silence could no longer serve. As I set the table that night, laying out plates, pouring water, folding napkins, my hands no longer trembled. The house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, a meal I had cooked countless times for my family. Except this time the meal was not for nourishment. It was bait. When the doorbell rang, I felt no fear. This was my first move, and it would not be my last. The night of the dinner, my house felt like a stage. Every plate, every glass, every candle I lit was a prop. The roasted chicken filled the rooms with a comforting aroma, but beneath it all was tension so thick I could almost slice it with the carving knife. I had invited them under the pretense of peace. "Let's sit down and discuss the future," I'd said, my voice steady, almost resigned. Sharon had jumped at the chance. David's smug tone over the phone carried triumph, as though he believed he had finally worn me down. Kelly sounded almost relieved, as if I were finally ready to be reasonable. But the truth was, this dinner was never about surrender. It was about exposure. Thomas arrived first. My son, 25, quiet, thoughtful. He had inherited George's height but not his confidence. His hands fidgeted with the sleeves of his shirt as he walked in, but his eyes were sharp. He saw more than he let on. "Mom," he said softly, glancing at the table. "Why are you really doing this?" I smiled faintly. "Because they think they've already won. Sometimes, Thomas, the best way to fight is to let your enemy show their hand." He didn't press further. He sat, watching me with the wary concern of a child who knows his mother is walking into fire. The doorbell rang again. Sharon entered first, her pearls gleaming, her perfume wafting in like smoke. Behind her, David swaggered in, carrying a leather folder under his arm as if it were a crown. Kelly trailed them, her eyes darting nervously between us, her smile brittle. "Mother," Sharon said warmly, as though we were lifelong friends. The falseness in her tone made my skin crawl. "What a lovely home. Though I do wonder how you manage it all alone." Her words were sugar wrapped around poison. I said nothing, only gestured toward the table. We sat. Forks scraped against plates, glasses clinked, but beneath the polite sounds was an unspoken battle. Sharon talked loudly about David's career, his ambition, how Kelly was settling into her role as a proper wife. Each sentence was designed to diminish me, to remind me that in her mind, I was already irrelevant. Finally, David leaned back in his chair, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and opened the folder with deliberate slowness. He pulled out a fresh contract, the papers crisp, the ink shining under the light. "Here we are," he said casually, sliding the stack across the table toward me. "Just a simple agreement. Transfer the deed, transfer your savings, and in exchange we'll take care of you. Kelly deserves stability, and frankly, so do you. Sign it and all this unpleasantness goes away." Kelly nodded quickly, as if to support him. "Mom, please. Don't make this harder than it has to be. It's just paperwork." Sharon folded her hands, her smile razor-thin. "Sign it, Nancy, or you'll shame your daughter in front of the entire family. Do you really want to be the reason for their struggles?" The silence that followed was suffocating. My hands rested lightly on the table, but inside my pulse thundered. This was the moment. Before I could speak, Thomas stood. His chair scraped back loudly, jarring in the quiet room. "Enough," he said firmly. His voice was steady, louder than I had ever heard it. He looked directly at David, then at Sharon. "Mom doesn't owe you anything." The words cracked through the air like a whip. Sharon's smile faltered. David's face tightened, the smirk slipping for the first time. Kelly's eyes widened, torn between loyalty to her husband and the shock of hearing her brother speak so boldly. "Thomas," Sharon said smoothly, trying to recover. "You're young. You don't understand how these things work. Family takes care of family. That's all we're asking." "No," Thomas said, his voice even sharper. "That's not what you're asking. You're demanding. You're bullying. You're trying to strip her of everything she's built. And I won't let you." The room went still. The only sound was the faint hiss of the candles burning down. David leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Stay out of this, Thomas. You don't know what's best." "I know enough," Thomas *T back. "And I know you're nothing but a parasite." Kelly gasped. "Thomas." But Thomas didn't look at her. His eyes stayed locked on David, unflinching. The air around the table felt charged, like the second before lightning strikes. I looked at my son, my heart swelling with pride and sorrow all at once. For years I had fought alone. For the first time I wasn't. I reached for the folder, not to sign but to touch it. The papers felt heavy, obscene, as if they carried the weight of their greed. I set them back down with deliberate care. "I will not sign," I said quietly but firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Sharon opened her mouth, but Thomas's voice cut through again. "You heard her. The conversation's over." The tension at the table was unbearable. Sharon's pearls seemed to tighten around her neck. David's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. Kelly began to cry, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "Why are you doing this, Mom? Why can't you just trust us?" Trust. The word burned. Trust was what I had given freely for decades. And this was how it had been repaid, with humiliation, manipulation, betrayal. I looked at each of them in turn. Sharon cold and predatory. David arrogant and entitled. Kelly broken between them, her loyalty stolen. And then I looked at Thomas. Strong. Steady. Finally awake. The family divide was no longer a crack. It was a canyon. And there was no going back. The dinner table still smelled of roasted chicken. But the food sat untouched, congealing in silence. Sharon's pearls no longer gleamed. They seemed to tighten around her throat like a noose. David's contract lay on the table between us, a monument to their greed. Kelly wept quietly, her tears staining the napkin she clutched like a lifeline. I had listened. I had endured. I had been mocked, pressured, humiliated. But now at last it was my turn. I rose slowly, letting the chair scrape against the wooden floor. The sound deliberate, commanding. My hands did not shake as I crossed the room. From the cabinet I retrieved a folder of my own. A thick one, worn at the edges, heavy with the weight of truth. I carried it back and placed it carefully beside David's shiny, fraudulent contract. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. David sneered, though his smirk faltered at the edges. "Another attempt to stall? More excuses?" I opened the folder. The papers gleamed under the chandelier. Copies of George's will, certified bank statements, proof of accounts. Numbers that would silence even the loudest mouths. Legal documents confirming my ownership of the house, my independence, my competence. I have enough to live, enough to provide for myself, and none of it belongs to you. I let my words drop like stones into still water, each one sending ripples across their smug faces. Sharon's mask cracked first. The corners of her mouth trembled, her eyes narrowing with dawning realization. David's color drained. He leaned forward, scanning the documents, his arrogance dissolving with each line of text he tried to read. His lips moved, muttering figures he couldn't comprehend. And Kelly, my daughter, burst into tears. She pressed the napkin harder to her face as though she could hide from what was unraveling before her. Their scheme, so carefully built on whispers and arrogance, collapsed in seconds. "You planned to strip me of what you thought was my only security," I continued, my voice colder now, sharper. "But you never imagined that I had more than you could dream of. You saw a weak widow living on scraps. You saw a burden. You saw nothing. But what you failed to see is that I have everything I need. And more." Sharon's voice finally broke through, shrill and trembling. This is absurd. No woman of your age can handle this kind of money responsibly. It must be a mistake." "No mistake," I said evenly. "Every cent accounted for. Every tax paid. Every paper in order. I've managed quietly for years while you strutted and whispered. And now you know the truth." David's fist hit the table, rattling glasses. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he demanded, his voice raw, desperate. "Because it was never yours to know," I snapped. "It still isn't." Thomas, silent until now, leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "You heard her. This ends here. You won't push her again." The room fell into chaos. Kelly sobbed harder. Sharon hissed curses under her breath. David stammered excuses. About stability, about family, about how they only wanted to help. Lies, all of them. I stood taller, my voice cutting through their noise. "No more. No more contracts. No more pressure. No more humiliation. You will not touch my house, my accounts, or my dignity. Ever again." The silence that followed was deafening. Sharon rose suddenly, knocking over her chair. "You'll regret this," she spat, her face twisted. "We'll take this to court if we must. We'll prove you're unstable, incapable, senile, whatever it takes." I felt the fury rise in me, but I did not flinch. "Try," I said coldly. "Bring every lawyer in the state if you wish. But remember this, truth leaves scars, and the scar you bear tonight is permanent. Your greed has been exposed. Your lies are dead. And I am not the weak woman you thought." David shoved the contract back into his folder, his hands clumsy now, no longer confident. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice hollow. "No," I agreed. "It isn't. But it's the beginning of your end." They left in a storm of perfume, slammed doors, and muffled sobs. Kelly couldn't even meet my eyes as she trailed behind them, her shoulders hunched. When the door finally closed, the house exhaled. Thomas turned to me, his expression a mix of pride and sorrow. "Mom, you've been carrying this all along?" "Yes," I whispered. "Because I knew this day would come." He nodded, no more questions. Together we sat at the table surrounded by untouched food and extinguished candles. In the silence I realized what had just happened. For years they had chipped away at me, mocking, prodding, testing. And now, with one folder, I had shattered their illusion of control. It was my counterattack. And it had struck home. But as I sat there, staring at the empty chairs where Sharon and David had been, I also knew something else. They would not stop. Greed never does. 1 month after the dinner, I found myself standing before a judge. Exactly as I had predicted, Sharon and David had not accepted their defeat at my table. They regrouped, sharpened their knives, and launched their counterattack, this time through the courts. The summons arrived on cream-colored paper, the kind meant to look official and int asterisk mid-18. It accused me of being mentally unfit to manage financial affairs. They claimed my irrational refusal to cooperate with family support endangered my future stability. In their twisted version of reality, I was the villain. Stubborn, confused, incapable. When I held the paper in my hands, I laughed. A cold, sharp laugh that surprised even me. So this was their plan. Not to prove they loved me, not to show they cared, but to erase me legally, to have me declared incompetent. The courtroom was packed the morning of the hearing. I wore a black suit George had once admired, my hair pinned neatly, my papers organized in a leather folder. I would not appear weak. I would not appear frail. I would appear exactly as I was, sharp, clear, and ready for war. David and Sharon arrived like royalty entering a coronation. He wore a brand new suit, his tie knotted too tightly, his jaw set in arrogance. Sharon glittered with jewelry, every pearl and diamond a wee *P*N meant to dazzle. Kelly followed them, pale and nervous, but still walking in their shadow. Their lawyer was young, slick, with a smile that curled at the edges like spoiled milk. He carried their arguments in a briefcase as though it were a treasure chest, confident he could bury me under paperwork and lies. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. His gavel struck wood, and the sound reverberated like thunder. "We are here to determine the financial competence of Mrs. Nancy Carter." Sharon's lawyer rose first, delivering his performance with all the drama of a stage actor. He spoke of my age, my confusion, my supposed erratic behavior. He pointed to the fact that I had resisted transferring property to Kelly and David as proof of instability. "Any reasonable mother," he said solemnly, "would wish to provide security for her child's future." I wanted to laugh again. According to him, greed was filial duty, and refusal to surrender was madness. Then came the witnesses. Sharon testified with tears in her eyes, her voice trembling as she described my paranoia and decline. She spoke of me like I was already lost, a helpless relic wandering in confusion. "It breaks my heart," she told the court, "to see Nancy suffering like this. We only want to protect her." Her performance was almost convincing. Almost. David followed, his voice louder, firmer, laced with indignation. He spoke of my recklessness, my stubborn refusal to accept help. He painted himself as a dutiful son-in-law, forced into this position only by my own negligence. His words dripped with false sacrifice. And then Kelly, my daughter. She stood on the witness stand, her hands trembling, her eyes darting away from mine. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, But her words stabbed deeper than any of Sharon's or David's. "My mother has changed," she whispered. "She used to be so strong, but now she isolates herself. She doesn't let us help her. She refuses to make decisions that would benefit everyone. I don't recognize her anymore." I closed my eyes as she spoke. Each word was a blade twisting in my chest. My daughter, the child I had loved more fiercely than myself, stood in a courtroom and called me incapable. But when my turn came, I rose without hesitation. I walked to the stand, my step steady, my folder clutched tightly. I looked at the judge, then at the gallery filled with neighbors, strangers, and those who had come simply to watch a spectacle. And I told my story. I spoke of George's foresight, of the documents he left me, of the inheritance carefully hidden and diligently managed. I described every tax filing, every receipt, every legal safeguard. I laid the proof before the court. Years of responsible management, accounts in order, nothing amiss. "I am not confused," I said clearly. "I am not reckless. I am not unstable. I am a woman who has managed her affairs quietly and efficiently, while being humiliated by those who claim to love her. What Sharon and David want is not my safety. It is my money. And this courtroom is simply their last P*N. My lawyer, Mr. Langford, rose then. He presented copies of every document I had entrusted to him. He cross-examined Sharon until her polished words unraveled, revealing contradictions. He pressed David until his arrogance slipped into anger, showing the court his true face. And when Kelly's tears flowed again, he asked her simply, "When was the last time you called your mother without asking for money?" She could not answer. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Finally, the judge leaned forward, his eyes sharp. He shuffled the papers before him, glanced once more at me, then at Sharon and David. His voice was calm, but every word struck like a hammer. "This court finds no evidence that Mrs. Nancy Carter is mentally unfit to manage her affairs. On the contrary, the documentation provided demonstrates careful and responsible financial management. The petition for guardianship is denied." Denied. The word rang through the room like a bell of freedom. Sharon's face twisted, her pearls suddenly meaningless. David's fists clenched on the table, his jaw tight with rage. Kelly lowered her head, tears streaming, unable to meet my gaze. And then the final blow. The judge turned to them, his eyes cold. "Family should be a source of support, not exploitation. I suggest you reconsider how you treat Mrs. Carter moving forward." His words stung more than any gavel could. They were branded into the air, into their reputations, into the memory of everyone watching. When the gavel struck again, the case was closed. I walked out of that courtroom with my head high, my documents safe in my arms, my dignity intact. Sharon and David trailed behind me, whispering furiously, their plan shattered. Kelly stayed behind, crumpled in her seat, lost in tears of her own making. That day, I did not just win a legal battle. I reclaimed my voice, my name, my freedom. And as I stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, I swore to myself, never again would I allow them to treat me as a burden. Never again would I be silent. The war had reached its turning point, and the victory was mine. The day after the court's ruling, I woke to silence. Not the suffocating silence of shame, not the heavy silence of fear, but a clean silence, like fresh snow covering the ground after a storm. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing myself for the phone to ring with Sharon's sharp voice or David's smug demands. I wasn't anticipating Kelly's soft but poisoned pleas. The war had been fought, the verdict rendered, and for once I was the one left standing. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of strong coffee, the morning light pouring in through the lace curtains George had chosen years ago. I let myself savor it, the simple act of being free. Then I began the next chapter. With Mr. Langford's help, I purchased a lakefront home 2 towns over. It was not extravagant, though it could have been. I had 9 million reasons to indulge, but I wanted peace, not spectacle. The house was white with blue shutters, sitting close enough to the water that I could hear the waves lap against the dock at night. When I signed the deed in my name alone, my hands were steady, my heart calm. Moving out of the old house was both liberation and grief. Every room carried echoes of George. His chair by the fireplace, his tools in the shed, his handwriting in old notebooks. Leaving it behind felt like tearing a scar open, but it was also necessary. That house had become a battlefield, scarred with Sharon's laughter, David's arrogance, Kelly's betrayal. I needed walls that had not absorbed their poison. Thomas helped me move. Box after box, trip after trip he carried without complaint. We didn't speak much during those days. His silence was not cold but protective, as though words might break the fragile peace we were building. At night we ate takeout on the floor of the new living room, surrounded by half-opened boxes. For the first time in a long while I felt a flicker of warmth. "Mom," he said one night, chopsticks in his hand. "I'm proud of you." I looked at him, startled. For what? For not letting them win. His words were simple, but they wrapped around me like armor. Once settled, I did something I had dreamed of for years but never dared. I started a foundation in George's memory, the Carter Scholarship Fund, dedicated to helping local students pay for college. The first checks went out quietly, without fanfare, to young people who reminded me of Kelly and Thomas at their most innocent, hopeful, eager, uncorrupted. It was money put to use where it belonged, not siphoned into Sharon's vanity or David's greed. The town, which had once whispered behind my back, now spoke of me differently. Nancy Carter, they said. The woman who stood her ground. The woman who built something from her pain. Some apologized quietly, embarrassed they had believed Sharon's stories. Others simply nodded at me in passing, respect in their eyes. It didn't erase the humiliation I had endured, but it shifted the balance. Kelly stayed away. She called once, weeks later, her voice brittle. "Mom, I don't know what to say." I listened, but I didn't offer comfort. "When you find words that are yours, not Sharon's, call me again." And I ended the call. She never called back. Part of me ached for her, the daughter I had raised, the child whose laugh once lit up our house. But another part knew she had chosen her side. Some wounds cannot be healed by waiting. Some must be left to scar over. David fared worse. Word spread quickly about the courtroom humiliation, about the judge's rebuke. His reputation soured. Clients left him, colleagues avoided him. Eventually I heard he lost his job. Sharon, too, was quieter in town. Her pearls still gleaming but her smile dimmer, no longer smug. They had thought they could brand me as senile. Instead, they branded themselves as vultures. I did not gloat. Victory was not sweet, it was necessary. But I allowed myself one moment of satisfaction, standing at my new dock, the water rippling under the sunset, whispering to George, "We won." Life slowly took on a rhythm. Mornings with coffee by the lake. Afternoons spent reviewing scholarship applications. Evenings when Thomas visited, bringing laughter back into my life in small doses. I rediscovered books I had once loved, cooked meals for myself without worrying who would mock them, planted flowers by the porch that bloomed defiantly toward the sun. But freedom is not the same as forgetting. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the water outside reflected the moon, I thought of Kelly. I wondered if she would ever see the truth, that her mother had not abandoned her, but protected herself from the people who had twisted her love. I wondered if one day she would walk up my porch steps, contrition in her eyes. But I no longer waited for it, because waiting for her would mean chaining myself again. And I was done with chains. One evening, I took out the old lilies I had pressed between the pages of George's Bible. They were brittle, their color long gone, but they carried a memory. I placed them on the mantel in my new home, not as a symbol of loss, but as a reminder. Beauty fades, betrayal wounds, but survival remains. For the first time in decades, my life was mine alone. Not George's widow. Not Kelly's mother. Not Sharon's target. Not David's victim. Just me, Nancy Carter. And in that solitude, I discovered something I had forgotten long ago. Peace. It did not roar. It did not dazzle. It settled quietly into my bones, into the rhythm of waves against the dock, into the steady beat of my own heart. The war was over. And though the scars would never disappear, they no longer shamed me. They crowned me, because betrayal may break the heart, but survival sharpens the soul.